May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Tensions were rising. Clashes of culture bound everywhere. The Israelites were finally living on the promised land by God, and the temple had been reconstructed for their worship. At first glance, peace seemed to rule the land, but it didn't take long to see another story. Their land was occupied by the Romans, and it fell on a precious trade route. Sure, they could go to the temple and worship if they wanted, but they also couldn't hide the fact that the Romans really ruled Palestine. After all, they were taxed heavily, all in the name of a Lord in which they did not profess. Revolts would rise from time to time, and in return, the Romans would crucify those who protested too loudly. They needed to keep quiet, lest it happen again. But there wasn't just tension between the Israelites and the Romans. No. Tension was rising from within as well. You see, the Sadducees maintained control of the temple, often with the help of the Romans, and they did not get along with the Pharisees. And then there were the Essenes, who thought both groups were wrong about just about everything, so they went off on their own and started their own community. Not to mention the Zealots, whose sole purpose in life, it seemed, was to overthrow Rome. If something wasn't done soon, the whole system would collapse into war. Meanwhile, there was a rabbi out of Nazareth, born of questionable parentage, rumored to be the kid of an unwed mother, yet a descendant of David. He lived a strange way of life, teaching a stricter Torah, but healing on the Sabbath. He demonstrated non-violent love, yet was also rumored to be the next long-awaited Messiah. People were beginning to follow him in large numbers, by thousands even. And if they weren't careful, the peace held under Roman rule might come crashing down. One day, this rabbi learned that his dear friend Lazarus had fallen ill and died. So he and his followers went to Bethany, where they lived. He encountered Martha, Lazarus' grieving sister, who was upset because the rabbi didn't arrive in a timely fashion. But the rabbi asserted that it wasn't too late. So he, Martha, and her sister Mary, and a large crowd of mourners went to a cave to where the man was buried. The rabbi commanded Lazarus to get up and come out of the grave. And he did. Many people believed in him because of this miracle, but it also caused a frenzy. Some of them were upset, and this mob went to the Pharisees and told them what the man did by raising Lazarus from the dead. And the chief priests and the Pharisees called together a council and began to fret. What are we going to do about this? They asked. He has done some amazing things, and if we let him continue like this, everyone will believe in him. And then Rome will come and take away both our temple and our people. We will lose all the power we have. But Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, told them, "Do you not know anything? Can't you see that it is better for one man to die for the people rather than the whole nation to be destroyed?" So from that day on, they plotted to kill Jesus. This Lent, we've been examining the cross through different lenses or models of atonement. Christians believe that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we are reconciled with God, others, and ourselves. Where they differ is the how. Today, we are going to examine one of the newer models of atonement, the scapegoat model, which was developed by anthropologist René Girard. This model asserts that Jesus is a victim of human violence, and his death reveals our propensity towards violence and sin and overcomes it by submitting to it. Unlike other models of atonement, Girard comes to his groundbreaking theory of atonement not by asking theological questions, but by examining the claim that Jesus' death was one more in a long line of myths involving sacrificial death. But first, a little bit of theory. Girard spent his career studying ancient and modern literature from around the world. And early in his career, he saw a pattern of violence that spread across just about every single civilization he examined. First, he begins, all violence begins with mimetic or imitative desire, which is to say that what we want in life is based on what other people want. Mimetic desire in and of itself isn't a bad thing. In fact, this is how babies learn to smile, walk, and talk, and become functional people in society. But the issue comes when people begin to desire the same object and there aren't enough to go around. Thus, Girard asserts that mimetic desire essentially leads to rivalry. We see this play out all over the place. Think romantic comedies where two people are competing over the same love interest, or two political parties vying for control over the House or the Senate, or perhaps two siblings who are insistent on the same toy when you know that there are plenty of other perfectly capable toys to play with. Eventually, with rivalry, the desire to win beats the actual desire for the object. And then, rivalry begins to enter the social system, and tension and anxiety spreads across the group. Think about it. One day you could be gathering fruit with your peers, and then the next day you realize there's not enough fruit to go around. At any moment, the people you are cooperating with could become your rivals, which builds a constant level of tension. And if it builds enough, Girard finds that mob violence breaks out. But over time, society has found a way to release enough pressure to prevent a full-scale war. And this is what Girard calls the scapegoat mechanism. To save a society from an all-out war, the group would identify a scapegoat on which they project all their collective envy and rivalry and anxiety. They found that a scapegoat could be an individual or a group of people, and the marker can be essentially anything. Their sexual orientation, gender identity, immigration status, race, nationality, being left-handed, having an odd mole on your face, having too many pimples, not having enough pimples, being differently abled, being a child from an unwed mother, coming from Nazareth. The only qualification necessary to make someone a scapegoat is a simple marker to deem them an outsider. Girard finds the scapegoat is then vilified. People begin to falsely accuse them of taboo crimes in order to dehumanize them. And soon the crowd that had so much tension begins to unify against them. The people who were once on the brink of an all-out collapse now have something to unite around. And instead of an all-against-all war, it becomes an all-against one lynching. The scapegoat is then bullied, fired, incarcerated, deported, sent out into the wilderness, or killed. And once that happens, peace sweeps over the crowd. And no one has to feel responsible for what happens because they were the innocent ones and the scapegoat was the one that had all of the sin. No one has to claim fault because everyone did it. But the problem is, this relief only lasted for so long. Eventually, tensions build again, and another victim must be sacrificed to appease the mob. And over again, this Girardian cycle repeats. Innocent blood continues to be spilt under the guise of peace. So by now, my guess is you're probably thinking, Brittany, okay, this is a series on atonement, not anthropology. What is the point in all of this? I'm so glad you asked. You see, as Girard was studying the ancient stories from around the world, he noticed one collection of stories that was remarkably different from the rest. These stories, while they had their fair share of violence and scapegoating, began to unmask the system. Imagine, while the rest of the world was writing stories about casting their sins of society onto an innocent child and sacrificing them, the God of the Hebrew Bible opposed it. The story of Abraham and Isaac, for example, where God specifically denounced child sacrifice and provides an animal in his stead. Girard also found that there are these stories that are told from the viewpoint of the victim instead of the oppressor, like the stories of Abel and Hagar and Joseph and Job, which were completely unheard of for the time. And then he found there were the bold declarations of the prophets, like Hosea, who preached that God desired mercy, not sacrifice. You see, all throughout the Hebrew Bible, stories brought evidence that violence that brings about a temporary peace is not the kind of peace that God desires, nor is the sacrifice of an innocent human blood necessary for the reconciliation of God. Instead, by giving voice to the victim and by suggesting animal sacrifice rather than human, God was trying to wean humans off from the need from scapegoating from the very beginning of the story. But God doesn't end there. Which brings us back to Jesus. As Girard examined the life of Jesus, he noticed the stage was set perfectly for the next scapegoat. Society was on the brink of war. There was tension between the Jews and the Romans, and between the Jews and other Jews. If something wasn't done, war was going to happen. Enter Jesus, a rabbi who was teaching a different way of life, one who regularly associated with tax collectors and women and other prime candidates for scapegoating. His very presence was stirring up the crowds, and those that were trying to keep the peace with the Romans were starting to get a little antsy. Fortunately for them, Jesus was a perfect candidate for scapegoating. So Caiaphas suggests that age-old mechanism Girard kept finding throughout civilization. It is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed, he says. In other words, Caiaphas flat out says, people, we need a scapegoat or we're going to have a war. Caiaphas knows the power of channeling all of a group's anxiety into one person because it isn't anything new. If he can get Jesus charged with blasphemy and plotting to overthrow the Romans, social taboos for the time, then it would be enough to relieve the pressure and unite the people once again. And if we follow the narrative of the Passion, this is precisely what happens. On Sunday, people are lining the streets, laying down palm leaves and shouting, "Hosanna!" And then by Friday, with rumor of the arrest, their words quickly transform into "crucify him." Jesus is charged with blasphemy and subversion, and even if there is a suspicion in the crowd, they are drowned out by groupthink. So much so that by the end, even Peter, one of Jesus' most devoted friends, denies even knowing him. See, that's the thing about scapegoating. Even the most unlikely of candidates can fall trapped to the heinous schemes if we aren't paying enough attention. So the Roman authorities do their best to dehumanize Jesus. They dress him up in elaborate garb. They beat him until he's no longer recognizable. After all, the more different, the more other, the easier it will be to kill him. And so, as Gerard saw, the age-old story of the scapegoat mechanism repeats. Jesus falls victim to the human trap of the scapegoat mechanism. But this time, Jesus completely reveals what God has been unmasking throughout the Bible. The scapegoat mechanism is a flawed, corrupt, and unjust human-made system. And it simply doesn't work to bring about true sustainable peace and reconciliation. And he does this in two ways. First, there on the cross, the victim is given a voice like none other has ever had. And by doing so, he reminds us that we know not what we are doing. See, one of the key hallmarks of the Gerardian cycle is the belief that the oppressors are innocent and the scapegoat is guilty. But in the gospel, even while Jesus is there on the cross, he is pronounced innocent. So according to this model, God had no need for sacrifice. We did. And God did not need to kill Jesus either. That was us, too. In this narrative, it is not an angry deity who needs humans to sacrifice a scapegoat in order to appease it. Rather, it is the deity that enters into our system to show us that this has never worked in the first place. No, God has been trying to wean us off of sacrifice from the beginning of days, but it is us who thirst for blood. And instead of allowing the cycle to continue, God becomes the one who is rejected and expelled. And as such, Jesus aligned himself with all the innocent victims there ever were, ever will be, and are currently. And if that's all that there was, if Jesus lived a radical life, preaching inclusion and nonviolent resistance, only to be scapegoated by humankind, even then, we could still have solace in the fact of a faith which boldly calls out a corrupt mechanism that intrinsically targets the marginalized and the vulnerable. We could celebrate the great unmasking of a cyclical tragedy that chooses temporary peace over wholeness and mutuality. But this act on the cross spurred a movement. And that is how it failed for a second time. As theologian Mark Heim writes, when the mythical sacrifice succeeds, peace descends, true memory is erased, and the way smooth for the next scapegoat. But in this case of Jesus' death, something else happens. People do not unanimously choose to close ranks over Jesus' grave as the executioners had hoped. Nor is there a spree of violent revenge on behalf of the crucified leader. Instead, an odd, new counter-community arises. One dedicated both to the innocent victim whom God vindicated by resurrection and to the new life through him which no longer requires such sacrifice. Jesus not only exposes our darkest sin, Jesus offers us a new way of life. To be a part of the Christian community, then, is to walk the path of non-rivalry. Jesus invites us to break the system of harmful mimetic desire and instead imitate his own desire to resemble love the best way we can. This, according to the scapegoat model, is the good, reconciling news of the gospel. That because of Jesus, we get to creatively forge a new way of life together, to craft a new narrative, to call out and reject the harmful rhetoric of us versus them, to name scapegoating when we see it, and to have a collective we together. And I cannot think of a better way of doing that than by gathering around the table together for communion. Because here at this table, we remember the very real life and death of Jesus. Here we proclaim the message that gathering together to share a meal with the victim has more power to promote peace than sacrificial violence ever could. And here, at this table, when we take the bread and drink the cup, body and blood, we take a vow. Never again. Sacrifice stops here. Amen.
Our ancient curse we put Join me in the words of invitation. You will read the bold. When Jesus sat at tables and broke bread with tax collectors, lawyers, rich elites, and poor peasants, he proclaimed that God's gracious love and abiding presence knows no bounds. Through these occasions of sharing food, people experienced God and shared in God's kingdom, a kingdom where all are welcome, worthy, and invited. Lives are transformed and empowered, and the fruits of God's gentle justice bloom throughout all creation.
All people,
including each of us, are invited to share in this sacred meal of celebration and be strengthened by the presence of God in this place. So hear these words of institution. When his arrest seemed near, Jesus ate a meal in an upper room with the disciples. He took bread, and after having given thanks to you, holy God, he broke it. And he gave it to his disciples, this time saying, "Do this to remember me." And after the meal, he shared wine, gave thanks, and said, "I will not drink from this cup again until I drink it with you in the kingdom of God." Jesus was then unjustly killed by the systems of domination of his day, but the resurrection provided a new hope. We thank you, holy God, that the Last Supper wasn't the last meal or the last word. His execution wasn't the end. The kingdom persisted, and it persists today through the people who seek to be your resurrection community. Despite the divisions, violence, and injustice in the world, God continually brings forth renewed hope for love, justice, and mutuality to and through each of us. Therefore, holy God, in the sharing of this bread and cup, we joyfully celebrate the hope-inspiring ministry and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Holy God, bless each of us and the meal we will share, so we may be open to your abiding presence, nourished by your gracious love, and strengthened by your resurrection power. Amen. You will receive the elements at your seats. We just ask you to hold them, and we'll take them at the end when everyone has been served. So come taste the kingdom and know that God's presence is here with us. we eat together the bread of heaven, the body of Christ. We drink together the cup of grace, the blood of Christ. Thanks be to God for these gifts that knit us together as community. We're going to stand and sing our hymn of commitment, Were You There When They Crucified My Lord? Let's stand and sing together.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometime it causes me to tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when he rose up from the dead? Were you there when he rose up from the dead? Oh, sometimes I feel like shouting, glory, glory, glory. Were you there when he rose up from the
We got a little Easter ahead of time this morning, didn't we? We take your bulletin and join me in the benediction. God, we are on a journey with you to the cross. The word is almost too big. We can't get our arms around it. Its meaning staggers us. May we take seriously the meaning of your cross as we take up ours, standing beside each other, daring one another to take the risk you ask, so that together we can live out your mission in the world. Amen.